The Susan Sherman Annual Distinguished Speaker Series is designed to bring scholarship and art commentary of the highest caliber to St. Louis. The past 4 speakers have been Glenn Lowry, the Chief Director of the Museum of Modern Art, Michael Kimmelman, the Chief Curator, Chief Art Critic of the New York Times, Jeff Rosenheim, a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and also someone who grew up in St. Louis. And in working with Washington University in St. Louis, we were able to present the artist Maya Lin. And I want to recognize Carmen Colangelo and Peter McKee for helping us do that. This program is supported by an endowment established by Susan and David Sherman, and I also want to thank them since they're here in the audience. And I also want to thank the DESLI Collaborative Vision administered by the University of Missouri St. Louis, who gives us additional support for this program. And I want to thank Susan Kahn and John Hilton for their help. Tonight, we are honored to have Robert Storr as the series' 5th distinguished speaker. Robert Storr is currently the Dean of the Yale School of Art in New Haven, Connecticut. Previous to this, he was a Rosalie Salo Professor of Modern Art at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. In the spring of 2007, Robert was asked to direct the 52nd Venice Biennale, the first American invited to assume that position. From 1990 to 2002, he was the curator and then the senior curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He also curated the Site Santa Fe's 5th International Biennial, which opened in 2004. Robert is a painter, a curator, an art historian, and a critic, and the author of many monographs and catalogs to which I refer back to often. I think what makes Robert such a great curator and a great dean is that he always remembers the fact that art comes from artists. In every exhibition that he's curated, you always are aware that every artist is respected and that their work well presented. Years ago, when I worked at White Columns, I asked Robert to be on one of our benefit committees, as I've asked many of you. This is when he was the senior curator at Museum of Modern Art. Not only did he let us graciously use his name, but he came to the opening, and I observed that amazingly, he was so generous with all the very, very young artists there. I know that they all appreciated this, and I'm sure that they all still recall that night. I'm sure that every artist that he has worked with fully feels that Robert supports them and their work. And as an institution that also puts artists and art first, I welcome Robert Storr.
The reason it's such a pleasure to be here is that this is exactly such an institution, and it follows exactly such a director. This is going to be a kind of a collage and a series of reflections, and not a formal talk as such, but a good deal of premeditation all the same. All of us are aware of how precarious the world is at the moment, and also, and I think this is one of the principal things to remember, of how much things have changed in better ways rather than worse ways. I don't want to get into domestic politics too much, but I will mention that the people in this country were very depressed about the future before the election. Now they have a future which in some ways is darker, but they seem less depressed. It may have something to do with an attitude towards problems having changed, although the problems have in many ways, as I say, worsened. And I want to, in a sense, draw out or explain from my point of view how that's worked, not so much in the political domain, although there'll be political dimensions to what I say, but in terms of the relationships of art. Now, in terms of the imagery here is all pictures taken by me, which is to say they're not very good, some of them, but they are at least on the site and firsthand, of the last Venice Biennale. The reason for doing this is, on the one hand, because you need something to look at in case you lose interest in what I have to say. Number two, because in considering the ways in which the world is in flux, one of the yardsticks are those things which are perennial or per biennial, I guess you'd have to say. That we know where we are relative to places we've been before, and we measure the changes from one cycle or one episode to the next against what we remember of those situations. The biennial, as an institution, was founded in the 19th century. And it was a distinctly 19th century institution. It was founded as an homage to the King of Italy at a time when Italy was just coming together as a nation. It has lasted into the 21st through 2 world wars and much else. So if you look over the history of the biennial, you can track what it is that people thought international culture was in ways that are sometimes very enlightening. When I was in Venice, I made a point of going to all the local bookshops and scrounging around in the back bins. And I have, I think, probably half, if not slightly more than half, of all the biennial catalogs ever published. And originally, they were not these massive tomes that we've been putting out lately, and which I think, given economics, will not be very common heretofore, from here on out. They were small little booklets with checklists and some illustrations. But in 1907, you do not find Pablo Picasso, who that year painted Demoiselle d'Avignon. And in 1940s, you do find a host of fascist artists supported by Mussolini, who kept the Biennale going into the war. But then you're reminded of the awkward fact of Italian history that some of the fascist artists were avant-garde and some of them were retrograde, and therefore that futurism was a feature of the Biennales, even as other kinds of neoclassical conservative paintings were also a feature. In other words, a lot of the things we think about as being givens or truisms about art begin to shake a little bit when you measure them against actual events, actual circumstances, and against long trajectories of history. There is a French historian, Fernand Braudel, who invented a kind of history in the 1950s and 60s, focusing on what he called longue durée. He said, changes happen slowly in cultures. And rather than looking at great men and great battles and great crises, he looked at agriculture. He looked at demographic shifts in population and the makeup of populations. He looked at all the slowly changing things in French culture in order to explain how France became what it is. We, in the world of culture, if you will, people who make cultural events, support cultural institutions, make art itself, tend very often to think in short periods of time and to think in terms of dramatic ruptures and changes. But the truth of the matter is that art actually really does change quite gradually, even though the appearance of an individual artist on the scene or of a fresh idea can be very jarring and abrupt and can make us think we've moved light years forward, when in fact we have only begun to glimpse a new thing, even as we are deeply involved in older and more slowly developing things. Now, this particular moment is one moment of that kind, so what I'm going to do is try and describe it to you. Gertrude Stein, who's a writer who I value very highly, made the case that description is analysis. Nowadays, a lot of art writing is not descriptive, but it is highly analytic. And by analytic, it means it is very abstract. It refers to exalted categories, vague and generalizing concepts. But sometimes, if you really want to get to the texture of things, to the meat of things, just describing the things as they are will get you closer to the big statements by an accumulation of somewhat smaller ones. So if I have a method in art history and in art criticism, it's sort of on that order. Anyway, as to the pictures, and I'm going to start them on an automatic cycle, which will keep them going. Get this down here. There you go. This is, by the way, the view down the main sort of alley of the Biennale as you come into the garden. Anybody who's been there will recognize it. In the background is the Padiglione d'Italia, which is the Italian pavilion, although this Biennale, which is being done by Daniel Birnbaum, has changed this name, and the Biennale Committee and system has altered its status. But it's an important thing relative to what I just told you, because this building in the background, covered by a wonderful text by Lawrence Weiner about changes in material and changes in culture. This building is actually a monument to fascist architecture. It is a neoclassical Art Deco building. So the first thing you see when you come into the Biennale is that building. And if you look up the way, you see Albert Speer's building for the German pavilion, and you'll see the Spanish and Belgian pavilions, which are also fascist buildings. And you'll again be reminded that modernism has not always been progressive in its politics. It has not always been forward-looking in its aesthetics. It has often been built out of compromises, of big changes in history happening unevenly and sometimes not clearly at all. Anyway, this is the view of a very good, brilliant, lightweight, I mean in the best sense of lightness, the lightness of being American artist Lawrence Weiner, who takes text and opens the world imposed on a building which is trying to hunker it down and solidify it. So with that minor editorial beginning, you will just see a lot of, this starts now. You'll see a lot of snapshots. This, for example, is part of the process of making a Biennale. These are the works of a group called Mourinho, and this is the place where they're found in Rio. A body of work made by a group of children living in favelas, they're now young men, out of the bricks which were used to make their own buildings. This is one of them singing, and this is the group as a whole. A kind of vernacular architecture made out of the refuse or residue of the slum buildings in this section of town, which is, by the way, overrun by drug gangs, very dangerous. And this is the work of Marek Sidibe in Bamako, so we've just gone from Brazil to Africa. In any case, it is what they call social sculpture. That is to say, not only a work which is made by a community for a community, but where the act of making the sculpture creates a community. It is the way in which something is built out of the scraps of a world which is extremely meager in many ways. And here we go to Ellsworth Kelly, and here we go to Sherry Samba, and so on. I'm afraid the timing on this is very rapid, so I'm just going to ignore them, but enjoy it. I've seen them. In any case, it would seem, and I don't think it just would seem, it is a fact, that we are at some kind of a turning point in the history of modern times, really. What kind of a turning point, how sharp a turn, how long duration it is, how deeply the trouble cuts, and how deeply things actually change is what we do not know. But something happened over the last several months, which is not just an iteration of something that has happened regularly before. A little bit like people who live in San Francisco, who always worry about whether the big one is going to happen. In the 1980s, at the end of the 1980s, there was a crunch in the stock market, and people were worried that it might be the big one. The minute they realized that it was a big enough one, but not the big one, people began to recoup, they began to sort themselves out, and those who had the means began to go into overdrive, doing exactly the things that got them into trouble in the first place. And it was as if that had never happened, except for those poor people to whom it did happen. But in any case, we survived one not quite big one and have headed into this next big one. And the question is partly, will we have learned from the previous experiences? Will we be thinking about how not to repeat this another time if we are lucky enough to get out of it without serious damage? But in any case, in the process between the early 80s and the present, and by the present I mean something just anterior to the current crisis, many things changed in the art world. Many of the things that changed were already in preparation in the 1960s and 70s. And many of the things that changed were altogether to the good and indeed long overdue. There was a time when the American art world was about New York. Since I come from Chicago, I felt this keenly. We were the second city. We were second city painters. There was a time when in New York it was about a very narrow range of things, of the things that were actually being done in New York, that had been sanctified by certain critics and certain institutions and certain collectors. There was a time when all of that stuff was pretty good, to tell the truth, but it was only part of a much larger picture of the evolving visual culture of this country. And the ways in which other things were cast into the shade, and the ways in which audiences were trained, in a sense, by the repetition of certain things they saw often, and the neglect of other things they saw not at all, or too little. They were trained to an idea of modern art that was exceedingly narrow and exceedingly ultimately dogmatic. Now, this situation sort of grew out of the Second World War, grew out of the sort of triumphalist feeling about abstract expressionist painting and allied things, and evolved into the 1960s with what was called the mainstream. And mainstream art was a sort of continuum of history that said American art has finally gotten on deck and is in fact the dominant kind of art in the world for the cutting edge of modern art. This all began to come unstuck in the 70s, or really at the end of the 1960s. It came unstuck in many ways, and it came unstuck against the background of the country itself coming unstuck. It is very easy now to read art histories in which all that you read is a history of style, but you don't necessarily read a history of context and a history of social realities. Now, often the histories of social realities and histories of context, unfortunately, neglect the art. In other words, we have a whole body of writing about art which is heavy, very ideologically oriented, lots of moralizing statements of one kind or another, and actual creations by individual artists and their variety get left out of that too, because everybody's trying to talk about history as if it had a single engine, was going in a single direction, and some people think it's gone straight to hell, and other people think it's just fine, thank you. But in any case, neither one of these tendencies really accounts for the variety of things that are actually happening around us. In the 70s, there was a moment that was called the pluralist moment. And those who believed in the grand trajectory of modernism, represented in part by the Museum of Modern Art as it was under Bill Rubin, the then curator of painting and sculpture, that grand trajectory they thought was in jeopardy because here were all of these new things going on. There was conceptual art with no objects, there was installation art that was not sculpture but something else, there was performance art in which the performer did a variety of unseemly things in a very, very public way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there was much hand-wringing in the camps that defended the good old modern. And the good old modern, which had once been radical, became the conservative old modern. You know, a recent example of this was when Morley Safer got on 60 Minutes and attacked Jeff Koons and Jenny Holzer and Robert Ryman, who normally are not grouped together, by the way. They're quite distinctive. Attacked them all as being represented in decline. I will point this one out. This is marvelous. Oops, can I back that up? Let me see if I can. Do one back up. This is a work by Dmitry Gutov. In our days, everything seems pregnant with its contrary, a text of Karl Marx. Without Marx's solutions, one could say that this is just such a moment. That everything we think we know also contains its opposite, its antithesis. And that getting used to this present situation is living with those contradictions rather than cleaning them up artificially. In any case, in the 70s, the pluralist moment happened. And we had this amazing diversification of styles and an amazing degree of debate about what art actually was. And as far as I'm concerned, debate about art is the moment when art is healthy. When people don't know who's on top and why, who's the cutting edge and why, who will last and why, there is more conversation among all the different people who are trying to make sense of what they see and make the case for what they value. That is the prime moment. That is what museums are about, actually, those that deal with contemporary modern art. They stage a form in which those debates can happen, when the contentions among different schools of thought, represented by the works of different artists, can actually take place in real time live. And the 70s was a moment where that was generally the case. Protests about the changing of programs of museums, protests about what should be called art and what should not be called art, bred a situation which is on the one hand very healthy for virtually every kind of art. Because rather than taking it for granted that color field painting was good, you had to make the case for color field painting. And rather than taking it for granted that conceptual art was good, you had to make the case for conceptual art, and so on down the line. By the way, Bruce Nauman, who's in the next room, is a fine example of an artist who has worked all across the map of contradictions and touched just about every medium and every attitude and shown, in fact, that you can not only live contradictions, but that you can, as an artist, in a sense, dedicate your life to articulating them better than they are articulated in the general culture. And by that, as he says, the true artist can help the world with mystic truths. In any case, in the 70s, you had this diversification, and among other things that happened was Hispanic artists, Asian artists, African-American artists, gay and lesbian artists entered into the world. And what happened is the knowledge of an art world which was not focused in just New York, but actually was across the country. Los Angeles emerged. Chicago had its moment. And the sense that this country produced art in every sector of the country and that there were useful and interesting distinctions among those sectors became something that was a sort of accepted notion, even though the contest for attention continued. Moreover, by the 80s and 90s, the recognition that in the Americas alone, there was, in fact, art being produced everywhere and that there were long histories of modern art. And that if one wanted to be a sophisticated viewer and advocate for modern art, it paid to know what was going on in Rio, it paid to know what was going on in Sao Paulo, it paid to know what was going on in Buenos Aires, in Mexico City, in Venezuela, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The internationalization of the art world took place in that time where the old national ideas that it was Paris or New York, it was color field or nothing, etc., began to dissolve. This created chaos. It also created vast and contentious markets. It also created all kinds of static in the air, and it made some people very nervous. But in fact, that kind of nervousness is a good thing. If you're going to talk about the jitters, those are the jitters you want to have. You want to have a sense of productive uncertainty and of access to anything that might give you good and useful information. And that time was a very fruitful time, and it was during that time that the big exhibitions of international, cosmopolitan, contemporary art began to be a regular feature of the calendar of people who paid attention to art. Documenta was founded in 1955, partly as a byproduct of the Cold War, to make an exhibition in Germany that would unite German culture after the war, and to do it right close to East Germany so that cultures on both sides. Oops, am I stuck? Anyway, Documenta began to be one of the engines of the internationalization of modern culture. And it's not for nothing that Gerhard Richter, a young socialist realist painter living in Dresden, moving up the ladder within the party structure of sanctioned artists, went to Documenta in 1959 as a reward for being a good party painter, and saw the work of Jackson Pollock and Lucio Fontana and didn't understand it and didn't like it and went home and thought about it, and 2 years later started his life over again in Dusseldorf. Similar kinds of things have happened in the Sao Paulo Biennale, which was founded in 1951 and which became the center of the culture of the visual arts in the Americas plural, uniting Canada and Latin American countries and this country, and also bringing a lot of work from other parts of the world into Latin America. And then there were the great shows of Harry Zeman, When Attitude Becomes Form, for example, which was the way in which conceptual art was introduced to a large public in Germany. The exhibition systems that we are dealing with now are products of this moment of uncertainty. And the fact that they were, most of them, improvised is one of the ways in which they were able to thrive. That they did not represent the settled opinion of different camps that had to be bartered and traded off and had to be negotiated and had to be set up in almost like treaties among schools and dealers and collectors, but rather it was a kind of flux where entrepreneurial curators and entrepreneurial artists and some entrepreneurial collectors and dealers got into the fray and began to make complicated shows where there was no one point being made and no one idea being propagated. This system has thrived pretty well for a long time, and actually at a certain point, it overtook the old system represented by the Biennale. I'm sorry, this is not working the way it's supposed to. Let's try again. No? Anyway, it's not a bad image to start on. What? I'm not a techie, so I don't know how to start it over, so I know. Anyway, we'll just leave that on. Anyway, this system intersected with the old system of salons, because the Venice Biennale is essentially an old-fashioned salon, a sort of slow-moving attempt to account for what was deemed good by official culture in Europe. And the Biennale system then became, for a dramatic way, the place where the international avant-garde was shown, because if Picasso was not in the Biennale in 1907, and if basically very little avant-garde art was ever shown in the Biennale until after the Second World War, and really until the middle of the 1950s, then you begin to understand that the longue durée of change in this world has essentially caught up with things sometime in the 1960s, when Robert Rauschenberg in 1964 won the painting prize, and an American artist was represented in a European show and recognized as such as the premier painter. That was a cultural change as dramatic as when European artists began to be recognized here, European artists belonging not to the School of Paris, but to the School of, if they can call this, the School of Cologne, or the School of Milan, or other kinds of places where there were avant-gardes very active that didn't belong to the established American ideas of where European culture came from. Now, this has all evolved, and it has all had tensions and frictions and so on and so forth, and along with it, of course, has evolved a very elaborate market. The market is not at all simple, and it is also amusing when I listen to critics of the market or to handicappers of the market say they know where the market is going. And they know what the market is about, and they understand who really controls the market. This flatters certain dealers who would like you to believe they do. This flatters certain paranoids who would like to believe that all of modern art is a conspiracy of some kind in late capital. or whatever context, that really these are constantly shifting grounds. But one thing for sure has happened is that the free movement of information has slowed down. There's an acceleration of publication, an acceleration of publicity, really, not publication, because a lot of what's written doesn't say anything about what it's writing about other than it exists and how much it costs. There's an acceleration of treatment of the social world around art. But one of the things that's happened gradually is that as the structure has diversified and gotten bigger and gotten richer, it has also gotten heavier and less flexible. There is less of a give and take about ideas and more of a kind of low-grade competition among brands, products, and nationalities. And this has put us in a terrible situation. And as somebody who took on the somewhat quixotic task of doing the Venice Biennale, I can tell you those pressures are intense. And I can also tell you that there are very few rewards for taking them on. You are there. I saw a beautiful painting of St. Sebastian and the Pulitzer's next door. And the only consolation I have is that I know that St. Sebastian didn't die. I'm hoping for a miracle. But in any case, the thing is that when you do these big exhibitions, you suddenly throw yourself into the middle of all these contesting forces. One way to look at the present situation is to see a sort of confluence of opportunisms jamming the system, clogging the system. And then suddenly, the fuel that makes that happen has been drained out. The money has been taken away. In fact, the motive for many people has been taken away. The attention to them as being power brokers and whatever has been removed. And there is a good deal of schadenfreude, pleasure in someone else's misery attached to this. This is, in case you haven't noticed, a very puritanical country. My people, meaning the Puritans who came here, my people made it so. And we have, in many ways, been embarrassed by our culture and wanted to justify it, or periodically we wanted to see its creators suffer for the pleasure that they provide, for the freedoms that they claim. There are many people now who look at the decline in the market as a chance to return art to its former purity, wherein artists will live in garrets again, will not be compromised by the almighty dollar or the almighty euro or whatever it is, none of which, by the way, are almighty these days. And that all of a sudden we will go back to an art which is untainted by all those worldly factors that in fact everybody, pretty much, including the relatively pure, were utterly fascinated about until about 5 minutes ago. Now, I frankly am not sorry to see some of that go away. As somebody who went to parties professionally for about 15 years, I really have had my fill, And I think one has to consider sometimes the hangover that comes with it, and the hangover is not just physical but spiritual as well. But be that as it may, the idea that we will correct art for the better by starving it, and by starving artists, is not a very positive sign. It is also profoundly ahistorical. The idea that artists should be poor in order to be pure is an idea that comes out of the 19th century romanticism that gave us what? La Boheme. And the lives of La Boheme, of artists sitting in the garret and dying of tuberculosis and making their great masterpieces, despite all, is the purest sentimentality of the 19th century, even though I happen to love Puccini and I listen to it a lot. This idea is unrealistic, historical, and has always been so. I was talking on the radio today, and I used to think this example, at least in a conversation with somebody. Just remember that Van Gogh, the famous ear-cutting, exemplary sufferer of art, the man that Antonin Artaud said suicided himself for society's sake, that man had a brother who was a dealer, nagged his brother to death, practically, to get his brother to help him get a career. If he didn't sell a painting, it was not for lack of trying. If he didn't seem to crave success, it was only because you hadn't read his letters in time to find out how much he craved success. But the idea of the pure artist is a fiction, and it is a fiction from which everybody suffers. If you look at the history of art and of the great artists, very, very few of them actually went hungry, and of those that went hungry, almost none of them went hungry out of a desire to have a kind of a monkish remove from the world. There was in the advance of the Biennale, I was asked to organize a conference. And the conference was to address the history of biennales, the structure of these exhibitions, and so on. And I invited a lot of people from a lot of different camps, including a lot of people who are involved in critical theory, people who talk about the state of capitalism and culture from a roughly Marxist point of view. I should say, by the way, they have a roughly Marxist point of view, but they have no Marxist practice whatsoever, which somewhat vitiates. Most of them are looking for tenure. I have Marxist friends, but I listen to the ones that don't have tenure. In any case, I took also the advice of somebody who knew a man, and I invited a man from Zurich who is an economist named Frey, a Keynesian economist, a student of the market system, who came to make an argument about culture. And he offended just about everybody there who felt themselves to be at the cutting edge of critical theory, who thought themselves as the inheritors of the German Frankfurt School, which melded Marx with a whole other series of ideological and intellectual tendencies, many of which, by the way, I'm sympathetic to. And what did he say that upset some people so much? He said, virtually no artist who is any good will be broke forever. That there will always be a market for works of art, whether it comes into play at the time that they make their work or not is a matter of many contingencies, and whether they will enjoy it or not is a matter of many contingencies, and whether it's manipulated by people with other agendas is almost guaranteed, but how much that will be the case is a matter of other contingencies. But the idea that good art escapes the market or seeks to escape the market is a fiction, from which everybody suffers. He also said there's another fiction. There's a fiction that given the market economy, that art in fact can be self-sustaining, and that therefore the idea that some people were putting forward at that time when everybody was running wild with oceans of cash and surplus from hedge funds and whatever it was, beginning to say, okay, fine, it's time that we now take away all the government supports that exist in Europe and the few that exist in this country. We take all of that away because art is self-supporting, good art will rise to the top economically, and we can apply kind of social Darwinist laws to culture. And not only that, we will have a better, clearer world, and we will have just as much culture. He proceeded then to draw a very careful economic map of exactly why this was not true. He compared the art system to sports arenas, for example, in major cities, and showed how it is that art will never produce a bottom line result that will sustain it, much less create a surplus for other people. And then he turned it around and he said, but this is the crudest economic argument. The real economic argument is what does the presence of art institutions within a community do for that community in ways that affect every aspect of their lives, for holding people in cities, for attracting people who will come and work in industries which require highly trained people, to create community centers for disadvantaged people and so on. By the way, this was a Swiss guy, right? And he wasn't an American progressive, trying to make this case. It was a Swiss econometrician. And he was basically making the argument that art needs to be subsidized, that it does have an economic benefit for the good, that is delayed, indirect, and cannot be quantified easily, but it is also measurable in the absence. And that basically, that things like the Venice Biennale, and under pressure at that time, I was under pressure at that time to reopen the sales office of the Biennale, which I refused to do, and to do a whole series of things to commercialize the Biennale, which I refused to do, and basically to treat the Biennale like an art fair, which I refused to do. He made the very strong case for how it is that the sustaining of cultural institutions is the work of the communities in which they exist, that this has got to be done as a government as well as a private enterprise, and how the benefits are widely shared and engendered. Now, let me back up from this and make sure I'm not overrunning my time. We are in a moment of change. We are in a moment where we have seen a massive increase in the numbers of arts institutions, a massive increase in the audience for art institutions, which is, by the way, important because you will still read things in magazines, as distinguished as the New Yorker, telling us that the general public doesn't like contemporary art and that is all foolishness. But the general public loves contemporary art. They love arguing with it. They love coming to see it, to say that they've seen it, and then to say that they think it's no good, and then to come back and see it a second time. The truth of the matter is that there's a wide public audience for art, and there are many kinds of contemporary art, so there's no one public audience for any one kind of contemporary art, nor is all contemporary art for one type of audience. This audience has grown, the institutions have grown, the markets have grown. The thing that we have less of, though, however, is a discussion of the art itself, is a serious look at an examination of what it's about, of why people made it, of what it means in context. What has produced this are some of the factors I've named, and if I were in sort of a diagnostic mode, I could go farther, but I would put you all to sleep before your dinner. But we have built this huge system, which at the same time is starving the art, even though it supplied an abundance of other things. Now that the system itself is beginning to starve, the question is whether or not we can turn this around somewhat. Whether or not we can use the release, if you will, from the kind of rapid response that we have been sort of accustomed to working in this cultural domain or being a part of it in any way, whether we can release ourselves from having to have an opinion on everything right away, for having to take sides on everything right away, for having to manage large concepts and large bodies of work without actually looking at them very carefully, without reading around them very carefully. If we can pull it back and begin to say, with any given context, there are these things that are necessary to sustain the health of the system. There are these natural interlocutors, people with whom we can talk about these things. There are these people who are more worth talking about than others, and frankly, there are. Let me say, I think Jeff Koons is a very interesting artist. I've known Jeff for a long time. We had a teacher in common at Pashki. I think Jeff is really strange. I think the amounts of money that are paid for Jeff's work is stranger still. But I think he's a very interesting artist. I think Damien Hirst is a much less interesting artist, sometimes not at all interesting artist. But when you talk about contemporary art, Jeff and Damien come up all the time, and the reason is simply that they broke the $20 million barrier. So they're a little bit like Hollywood stars who are paid an exorbitant amount to make a movie, and then afterwards you don't talk about the movies, you talk about their salaries, or who paid them for that matter. But to make a critical analysis of why Koons, from my point of view, is more interesting than somebody like Damien Hirst, is to enter into a serious discussion about serious things. To compare Koons to Richard Serra, for example. Or maybe the better one is to say Matthew Barney to Richard Serra. And why? Because Richard Serra, you would think, would have nothing to do with Matthew Barney, because they come from different aesthetic modes, because Richard's modernist idea is the antithesis of Matthew Barney's theatricalized postmodernist idea, and yet, when invited by Matthew Barney to appear in a film filmed at the Guggenheim Museum, Richard said yes. And Richard did a kind of auto-satire of his own work in relation to Matthew Barney's work. To have a conversation about the relation of Richard Serra to Matthew Barney, of Jeff Koons to Damien Hirst, and so on, is the beginning of the conversation. Take something else of Richard Serra's. Richard Serra is interested in a Catalan sculptor named Otesa, and Otesa belongs to a whole trend or category of constructed bent fold metal sculpture made throughout the Spanish-speaking world. If you're interested in what Richard Serra does, you should be interested in what Amilcar de Castro does. If you're interested in what Richard Serra does, you should be interested in a whole lot of geometric abstract art that was made in Latin America from the 1950s, actually 1940s, until the present. You should not only be interested in it, you should know about it in depth. If you're interested in Richard Serra, you should be interested in Elio Oiticica, who is now generally known by people who do art full time, but I can remember a time maybe 10 years ago whose name raised no reaction. And now, of course, his name is known, but his work is not known. One or two examples are here and there. Some kind of mystique has been developed around him, and he certainly deserved it. But in any case, the growth of the art world that I've described is a growth outwards to places where ideas connect, artistic accomplishments connect. And as you introduce yourself to those artistic accomplishments, you introduce yourself to new worlds. To learn about Latin American constructivism in the 1940s and 50s is to learn about an utterly different set of circumstances than applied in the United States. To learn about why that turned into performance art, why that turned into environmental sculpture, why a man like Oiticica, who was a prodigy of geometric abstraction, ended up in the slums, the ones I showed you at the very beginning, in the favelas of Rio, dancing in a samba band and redesigning the costumes of the samba bands, the traditional costumes of the samba bands, in a new geometrically based form. To talk about that is to discover a whole social world behind the formal object, and to discover a whole genealogy. His father, by the way, was a very distinguished constructivist photographer. Is to discover a whole genealogy. Now, wouldn't we rather do that than read the back of the book in most art magazines and see who went to the parties? Wouldn't we rather do that than open the New York Times and find out who posted what at auction and who failed to meet what auction measure? Wouldn't we rather talk about what is really going on in this work and take the rest of the business side of it in stride as we do in the rest of our lives? Wouldn't we rather do that than be preoccupied by art as a spectator sport of somebody else's money, or at least not mine? And I think that's sort of where we've gotten to, because now that you suck the money away, at least temporarily, it's possible actually to start those conversations again. It's very hard to get people to be quiet about things when there's so much sort of envy in the room. But when envy is removed, and you actually can then start talking about what you've seen, what I've seen, what you make of it, what I make of it, a different kind of conversation can develop. Now, I'm, again, mindful of my time, and I have about 5 minutes, so I will try and use it wisely. There is a model, and contrary to the thinking of some people who have typecast me as, I don't know, some conservative who never reads books, just writes them, I read theory a lot. And I am interested in theory a lot, and I am particularly interested in it because I worry a great deal about its misuses. I respect words, and therefore I don't like seeing them used casually. I don't like seeing big ideas reduced to a catchphrase, and that catchphrase repeated to the point where it has no meaning whatsoever, except as the counter in a winner-take-all conversation. If you can say rhizome and gotcha, or if you can say late capitalism and gotcha, or if you can say phenomenological presence and negotiating of the essence of difference, gotcha, you can pretty much run the art world, or could until recently. But I am interested in some other kinds of theory, even though I'm interested in the theorists who engendered those terms. One of the principal ones I'm interested in is a man named Mikhail Bakhtin, who is a Russian writer and theorist of literature in the Stalin eras, who lived under the worst circumstances for an intellectual that one could possibly imagine, and developed a whole set of ideas about how it is that culture comes to have meaning. Things that we cherish as culture have come to have meaning. Now, the stage setting, if you will, is very Russian. It involves a samovar and therefore tea. It involves an ashtray and therefore cigarettes. It involves a lot of time on your hands because actually culture is moving very slowly. It involves paying close attention to endlessly long books. But novels by Dostoevsky and others. It involves a context in which people get together to have and hash out ideas in relation to something they have in common, which in his case, again, was primarily the great novels of the 19th century. And he developed this model of talking about culture as a series of dialogues. That the dialogue rather than the argument, that the dialogue rather than the discourse. The discourse is usually, in most cases, a monologue about what you think. And a set of ideas according to which other people should think. A dialogue is an exchange of discourses, potentially, and perhaps something even more open than that. That he viewed the dialogue roughly as the following. That a dialogue is a circumstance in which first, if you're dealing with a work of art, the viewer, reader, listener, whatever it may be, engages in an exchange with the creator of the work. The meaning of the work lies between the two of them rather than in understanding the intention of the maker or in satisfying the desires of the spectator, viewer, listener. But then it gets more complicated. It turns out that the creator is in dialogue as well. Take the case of Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky's novels are a conversation that Dostoevsky has with himself and with other people in his world as embodied in characters. The characters each speak with a voice that represents one plausible, possible position in culture. And Dostoevsky's novels are arguments, basically, extended arguments about truth, about religion, about what it means to be Slavic, and on and on and on and on, and about evil. That within this set of voices, there are sharp contradictions. Another model of this in culture is French. It's Diderot, who created dialogues, where two characters debate an issue back and forth, and nobody quite wins. Or my favorite in the same mode is Oscar Wilde, who wrote an essay called The Critic is Artist, the Artist is Critic, which is not an essay really, it's a dialogue. Two characters, one of whom speaks a series of banal truisms about culture, and the other one who maliciously, delightfully, and inventively contradicts him all down the line. Now this is a very unfair dialogue because essentially one of the characters is the straight man for the other. But in any case, Wilde was so artful that the debate resonates because the less intelligent character says the less intelligent things that you and I think, only to be corrected by the more intelligent person who graciously doesn't completely pummel you as he instructs you to the narrowness of your views. Now, the dialogic model says we create meaning between us, the artist and the viewer, listener, spectator, reader, and that the artist himself or herself creates meaning by arguing with themselves, and that the whole of what we do in culture is to have that debate, and winning it is simply not important compared to the having of the debate, to the articulation that goes on while that is happening. Now, this is a different idea than saying, I got the best one, and I got the best artist, and I have it, and I have it, and I have it. It is a different one than saying, I belong to the right school and you belong to the wrong school, and you're wrong and I'm right and you're wrong and I'm right. It is different than all of the other measures that we have lately been using. I'm more famous than you are, I will get more famous than you are. All the other measures are static measures. They get you somewhere and then they leave you stranded in that place to defend it. They make conservatives out of people who think they're being avant-garde, because it's all about possession and defense of a possession rather than about the acquisition of things you cannot finally possess. The culture that is living in modern culture is the debate. I used to say to people at the Museum of Modern Art, if you enter into these halls, you should hear Mondrian arguing with Van Doesburg. And you should hear the both of them arguing with Miro. And the both of them arguing with art. And all of them arguing with Picasso, and Picasso joining them to argue with Dali. You should see not a continuous flow of ideas, but a complex tessellation of disagreements which make modern culture. And it is the way in which this dialectical tension takes place. Everything is contained by its opposite, or contains its opposite, pregnant with its opposite. It's the way that this operates that has engendered modern culture. The moment we're living now, finally, is where we are, by force, and unhappily in many respects, but nonetheless with possibility, being released from the lock that we've gotten ourselves into. We are back in a place where we can start to have the argument constructively again, because we've got very little else to do. And the other thing we can do is we can look at the things we have. People who collect art, and I do in a very minor way, or people who go to exhibitions don't need now to wonder what the, if you will, the secondary benefit of having been there or of owning is. You can just look at it. And let me just give you one example, and then I will leave you there. When I was very young and very green, I knew a woman who was very wealthy, and who was early on to modern art, and who made in Chicago at the Arts Club a number of important exhibitions in the 1930s and 40s, and who collected selectively a few things. And I was taken under her wing, and I would go regularly with her around the galleries when I was like 18 or 19. I wore the serape that I wore as a hippie in those days. I wore shoes that embarrassed her, and I did all kinds of things that made me completely of my generation. And she, who threatened to exile me if I ever voted for Jimmy Carter, but other than that, never got into a serious debate with me about anything. She took me around, and I saw the first Robert Ryman show that I ever saw, which was the Guggenheim Retrospective. I saw Eva Hesse's shows when Eva Hesse was still alive. I saw a lot of these things. And I also would go and spend weekends in her apartment. And in her apartment, she had, among other things, Kahnweiler's portrait by Picasso, a portrait of Fernand Olivier, also by Picasso, and Matisse's Grand Interior Nice, which is one of the very, very great Matisse paintings from that period. And I would get up very early in the morning, and I would get a cup of coffee, make it for myself. The servants in the house, and there were servants, hadn't gotten up yet. And I would just sit for about an hour or an hour and a half looking at one or another of these paintings. And it cured me of envy. It didn't make me want to own these paintings, it just made me want to be able to see them like that. And not without other people, but with that degree of intensity. Remove all the other stuff and just pay attention to that work of art. Now eventually, the Kahnweiler and the Grand Interior Nice ended up in the Art Institute of Chicago. I think firmly that works of art in private possession should end up in public domains. But they should come there under circumstances where what you do when you see them is not to consider the long history of their acquisition, as interesting as that may be to social historians or to sort of archivists of art, but actually what that thing is. And it should be presented to the public as if the public owned it by visual acquisition. The transaction that takes place then is a transaction between a viewer that the painting never met before and the painting that the viewer never met before, and nobody knows what the consequences are. That if you make culture in that public realm, and if you quiet the noise around how much is paid for this, or what the institutional politics of a place are, and all that other stuff, which I know, and which are important, but if you quiet that stuff and allow this interaction to take place, allow a value to emerge from the dialogue between the public and works of art, then this particular moment actually is the point where we can recuperate a lot that we have lost by having a surplus of what we didn't need. Thank you.